Hi, and welcome to the Middle Eastern Islamic History Series, episode number 45, the Middle Eastern theaters of the First World War or the Great War. For those of you who are unfamiliar, here are the rules. This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the other disciplines that we will be covering today. I'm a layperson who just finds this incredibly interesting, and I hope you do too. And that said, I present things from a secular perspective. There will definitely be discussions of religion. Religion is an important matter, there will also be discussions of war, but I'm going to try to be as nonpartisan as I can, trying to give an even-handed view as much as I can. And since this is a world war, and one of the things that has always bothered me is that somehow it changes from being a world war to a European and American war, I will, as much as I can, show the multi-continentality, if that's a word, of this war and how much it stretched across the entire face of the planet. That said, when I give my presentations, I ask that regardless of subject matter, let's be respectful, but I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and respond in real time. So if you have questions, interests, other things that come up while I'm doing the presentation, I will respond to them in due time. Please put them in the chat because I'm more than happy to engage. What I like to say is that these presentations, these classes are 101s and 201s, meaning 101, if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up on the basics. And if you know something, that's the 201. I'll probably tell you something that you didn't know in order to expand your horizons. I also have what's called a 2-hour hard stop. So in about 2 hours from now, that will be my last slide. Depending on where we are, if we're in the middle of the presentation, that's okay. We'll just pick it up next week on Thursday. And we'll continue from there. As Zach mentioned, we exist on donations. Please see our donation information in the chat. If you feel like what I'm presenting is worthwhile, absolutely, please donate. It helps us out. There's a question about how did World War I start? We'll definitely cover that in the presentation. Point number 7, dates are years of service. I've gotten this point a few times. If you see dates underneath a person's name, that is when they served in a particular role or as, so it might be when they were general or prime minister or something like that. It is not their birth and death date. And this is a recording. So like the other 44 episodes in this series and all future episodes in this series, this will be available on our YouTube channel. The information for that is in the chat. Thank you so much, Zach. And you can also see all of our other series that cover things like the Crusades, the European Union, ancient Rome, Asian philosophy. We really tried to do an ecumenical survey of history, politics, and culture. All right, so to remind us, we're coming off this Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 in the Ottoman Empire. And this war was a brutal war for the Ottomans. They lost badly. And they lost on both the European side and they lost on the East, in terms of their border with Russia in the Caucasus region. And accordingly, the Ottoman Empire had this sense of revanchism to get that territory back and a strong hatred of Russia. We also talked about that during that war, that 1877 to 1878 war, there was a bunch of rebellions that had existed in the Balkans region, and that those rebellions coming up was part of what Russia was seeking to support when it entered the war against the Ottoman Empire. But these massacres didn't go in only one direction. They went in both directions. You can see on the right-hand side, the execution of the Başibozuks and the expulsion in Tarnava were removals of Muslims who had been living in the Balkans. Some were murdered, some were forcibly expelled. And on the left-hand side, the massacre of Bulgarians at Stara Zagora and the Armenians fleeing Kurdish insurrection attacks. Those are Muslims murdering Christians. Of course, in Europe at this time, the Christian victims were prominently talked about, but the Christian perpetrators were not. And of course, this created a sense of inequality in perception from the Ottoman perspective, especially since most Ottomans associated more with their Muslim fellow Muslims who were suffering in the empire than they did with the Christian rebels. And we then talked about how even though the Russians had concluded a peace at San Stefano, it was undone by the Germans, led by their politician and statesman Otto von Bismarck, who was key in creating the German national state and initiating what was called the Second Reich, or the second imperial power, right? The first imperial power was the Holy Roman Empire. The second imperial power was this German Empire. And the third imperial power, the Third Reich, was the government of Adolf Hitler, right? So these are the imperial German governments punctuated by non-imperial German governments. There's a question about this map. This map is actually from Wikipedia. The map is in Bulgarian, for those of you who are trying to figure out what language this is. And you can see in green, you have the country of Serbia. In orange, you have the country of Bulgaria. Between Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, which is in brown, you can see Eastern Rumelia, which was at first separate from Bulgaria, but in 1885, there was an annexation performed where Bulgaria took over the territory of Eastern Rumelia and made it part of the Bulgarian state. But this situation that the Germans created under the Congress of Berlin seemed to satisfy nobody. The Ottomans were angry that they had lost territory, and the Balkans people were angry that they had not been able to get as much territory as they had previously had under the Treaty of San Stefano. In fact, if you look at the brown edge that goes from the northwest corner of Bulgaria, goes around what is today North Macedonia, all the way to the Aegean Sea, and then picks up again in the southeasternmost part of Europe, that was the territory that Bulgaria was promised under the Treaty of San Stefano. And so its losses under the Congress of Berlin were quite substantial. Now, following the war, power was consolidated into the person of the Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II, and he reigned as an authoritarian from 1876 until 1908. And during that period, he really tried to streamline thought, and he did this by exiling dissenting voices, primarily to Paris or to London. And he also built numerous schools and intelligence agencies designed to organize the Ottoman Empire into a Muslim fanatic state. And this term fanatic is used by people of that time to refer to those Muslims who felt that there was a need to create a state that identified as a Muslim state, in terms of it is a state for Muslims, and would pursue policies against those minorities that threaten the integrity of a Muslim state. It should bear repeating, right, that this is directly as a result and directly following these insurrections in the Balkans, which are directly from Christian groups who are identifying under their national groups and expelling Muslims. So this is part of that relationship, that negativity breeds contempt on both sides. We also see the entrenchment of the German-Ottoman alliance during the years of Abdulhamid. Germans send military commanders. You can see Kolmar van der Goltz in the center. He is there in Bitola, which is in modern North Macedonia, still part of the Ottoman Empire when this photo was taken. And here he is working with Ottoman soldiers. He would actually be part of the Germans who would be training Ottoman soldiers during the First World War. In fact, many of the Ottoman military positions had a German general coordinating or directly responsible for those movements. And Kolmar van der Goltz actually was primarily involved in the Mesopotamian Campaign, defending Iraq, which was an Ottoman territory, from British incursions from the southeast. We're going to talk more about that when we get to that part of the timeline. But it's really important to understand how strongly the Germans entrenched themselves in the Ottoman Empire. And from the German perspective, it was akin to having a colony. Germany had come late to the colonial enterprise. It had only unified as a country, right? The Second Reich only started in 1871. So by that time, Africa was pretty much already divided. Many of the Pacific Islands had already been taken. And so Germany wanted to expand, and it wanted to expand towards India. So the Ottoman Empire provided a route towards Persia, and from Persia to India that Germany could exploit. And that's why Germany helped build the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, which would effectively connect the capital of the Second Reich all the way to the easternmost regions of the Ottoman Empire. But the German interest was well received by the Ottomans as well. They built telegraphs. They helped consolidate Ottoman debt because the Ottomans owed significant amounts of money to foreign industrialists. They helped build schools and lead to the education of the Ottoman bureaucratic class. And the Ottomans received military training, as I pointed out, from these German commanders who'd been working in the Ottoman Empire. We then got to the Eastern question, and we talked a lot about the Armenian genocide in the last 2 weeks. So it doesn't really bear repeating here, save for the fact that the Congress of Berlin had escalated this issue to one of international significance. Under Article 61 of the Congress of Berlin, there was to be an international supervision of the 6 regions, the 6 rayons of the eastern part of the Ottoman Empire, where Armenians constituted a significant minority, if not the majority. And you can see those 6 regions on the map on the right-hand side. And in much of the West, posturing to protect the Armenians, regardless of whether that actually manifested with actions on the ground, was one of the ways of chest-thumping defense of Western civilization. For example, you have that quote from Prime Minister William Gladstone: to serve Armenia is to serve civilization. Notably, Gladstone did very little to actually serve Armenia, but it was an effective campaign against his opponent, Benjamin Disraeli, who wanted to pursue a more conciliatory approach towards the Ottoman Empire. We also talked about, especially during the Armenian genocide and before, the development of Armenian militant groups that were operating either in the Russian-controlled Caucasus or in the 6 rayons of eastern Anatolia. And these particular groups, the Dashnaktsuyun and the Hunchaks, were developed in Russian-controlled Caucasus, and they were both founded around 1890. In particular, the Hunchaks were a little bit more socialist than the Dashnaks, but both of them were considered militant and at times can be considered terrorist groups, operating in what are called Fidai coalitions, meaning that they are militant groups that are sort of semi-autonomous in the eastern part of Anatolia. The reason for the development of these militants is the failure of the Ottoman Empire to respect the rights of Armenians and continued harassment from local Muslims, primarily Kurds and Circassians, that we know already started in this period and was even discussed during the Congress of Berlin. This came to a head, the conflict between these militants and local Muslim fighters in the Hamidian massacres of 1894 to 1896, where Abdul Hamid II used his power to direct the creation of an irregular military force called the Hamidiya al-Ilara, or the Hamidiya Irregulars. And these irregulars were made of Turks, Kurds, and Circassians, who had impunity to attack the Armenian minorities that existed in the 6 rayons and outside of them. The Hamidiya al-Ilara, given this blank check to attack the Armenians, that there would be no criminal ramifications for their activities, began a massacre in most of the major cities and in much of the countryside of the 6 rayons, resulting in the death of 200,000 Armenians, about 20,000 Assyrians, which is another Christian minority. And we talked about this a lot during the discussion of the Armenian genocide. There was some Armenian resistance during that period, right? And you have cases of retribution by Armenians against the Hamidiya al-Ilara and some of their families. At this same time, we have a very interesting situation developing in the Balkans. And it's something that we've addressed, is that Muslims in the Balkans who are non-Turkic, we're talking about Slavs and Albanians, they tend to see themselves as the old guard in the Balkans, the supporters of the Ottoman Empire. They don't want to break away and form their own states, but they're increasingly noticing that the modernization reforms that are going on in the Ottoman Empire are going to leave them disinherited from the future of the Ottoman Empire. In many cases, especially when we talk about Bosniaks, who are the Muslims who speak Serbo-Croatian, and Albanians, these groups were disproportionately represented in the Janissaries, which had been disbanded now for about a century, and were disproportionately represented in the bureaucrats, disproportionately represented in the military, and they had a long tradition of service to the Ottoman Empire. In fact, Sarajevo itself, the city, which is now the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, was built as a military garrison for Ottoman soldiers who had just conquered the region. So when the Albanians met in the city of Peja, which is the city of Peć in modern Kosovo, we have the Albanians coming together, led by Haji Zeka, who was a long and veteran member of the Ottoman military. They came together to try and create a unitary Albanian province. And you can see that the territory that this would have controlled would have been the region of Sanjak, which splits Serbia and Montenegro. It would be the entire modern countries of Kosovo and Albania, significant parts of the country of North Macedonia, and northern regions of Greece. There's a question, did the soldiers or civilians commit genocide? If we're talking about the Hamidian massacres, I think that a very colorable case can be made, and Benny Morris, who is one of the most prolific researchers into the Armenian genocide, considers the massacres of 1894 to 1896 to be part of the larger Armenian genocide, and argues that it is actually a 30-year genocide, right, from 1894 until 1919. That said, there are those who say that the massacres don't rise to the level of genocide because there was no intent to exterminate, although it's kind of difficult to imagine that when Abdul Hamid II literally said in 1897, there is no more Armenian question, we have solved it. There's a question about the YouTube link. If you scroll up in the comments, you should be able to see it. It's called History, Fitness, and Investing. All right. At the same time, the Serbs are deeply unhappy with the conciliatory tone of their government. And so we have a group of militants led by a militant called Apis. His true name is Dragutin Dmitrievich, but his code name is Apis, and he helps to form what are called the Black Hand. This is a terrorist group operating based in Serbia with somewhat of the blessing of the Serbian government, but generally not. Generally against the interests of the Serbian government. The Serbian government realized that it had to maintain relations with its neighbor to the north, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was significantly more powerful than it. And in particular, the king of Serbia, Alexander I Obrenović, was a person who was rather conciliatory to the Austro-Hungarians. So Apis coordinated the assassination of Alexander I and his wife, Draga Mašin, and replaced them with a king from a rival dynasty, the Karađorđevićes. So you can see this is the coronation of Petar I Karađorđević, and even the picture in the newspaper shows his picture above the slain bodies of Alexander I Obrenović and Draga Mašin. Now, this Apis character, because of his role directly in the assassination and the degree to which Petar I owed his power to Apis, Apis managed to have a very strong and powerful role in the Serbian government, allowing him to coordinate the activities of this Black Hand more effectively, especially starting in 1911. We then move to the Bosnian crisis of 1908. One of the elements of the Congress of Berlin of 1878 was that Austria was given the right to annex, the right to control, but not annex, the territories of Bosnia, Herzegovina, and the Sanjak of Novi Pazar. You can see that in the map in the center. The Sanjak of Novi Pazar today is part of the states of Montenegro and Serbia. And of course, Bosnia and Herzegovina are the modern day country of Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, in 1908, there was a lot of political turmoil going on inside of the Ottoman Empire, right? We have the Young Turk Revolution, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. And because of this, the Austrians decided to seize the opportunity and annex directly Bosnia-Herzegovina and Novi Pazar. And of course, this was a diplomatic victory for the Austro-Hungarians and for the Germans, who were now able to exercise more political influence in the region, and really a loss for the Serbians and their chief defenders and backers, the Russians. And so Abdul Hamid, as we said, was ruling from pretty much 1878 to 1908, 20 years with an iron fist. 30 years with pretty much an iron fist, complete control, as most of the Ottoman sultans before him had been. But in 1908, there was a rebellion led by Enver Ismail Bey and Ahmed Niazi Bey to create the Young Turk government. Now we went into the difficulties and complexities of this in episode 40, but suffice it to say that there were multiple factions involved in this rebellion. They weren't all interested in the same outcome for the Ottoman Empire. Some, called the Liberal Union, were more interested in the promises of equality, of capitalism, and a Western European orientation. They did not win the day. Ultimately, those led by Enver Ismail and his Committee of Union and Progress, his CUP, were those that would decide the direction of the Young Turk Revolution. And they are what we will call unionists. They are unionists in much the same way that Irish unionists could also be called unionists. And that is in the sense of wanting to maintain a union within the Ottoman Empire, to not want to give up any more territories, and to take any action necessary to preserve the union of the Ottoman Empire. So in 1909, there was a counter-revolution. There were coups in Greece. And the coup in Greece is actually really important for the way that Greece will participate in World War I. In 1911, a number of military officers forced the Greek kingdom to accept more power delegated to Eleftherios Venizelos and Nikolaos Zorbas and a number of other military officials. Accordingly, those groups would begin to have a lot more power, especially in the northernmost regions of Greece, the areas furthest away from Athens. Starting in 1910, we also see that the Albanians are rebelling, which is a very strange turn of events, right? The Albanians, especially with the League of Peja and before the League of Prizren, are routinely establishing that they are interested in the preservation of the Ottoman Empire. In 1910, that's no longer the case. You have Albanians basically revolting on three different grounds. The Committee of Union and Progress, the party of Enver Ismail, has as one of its cornerstones Turkification, and we'll discuss a little bit more about what that is. But suffice it to say, at this stage, that Turkification requires the speaking, reading, and writing of Turkish as a dominant language in the Ottoman Empire, which was a vast departure from the way the Ottoman Empire had historically been run, with all of the different groups, be they Muslim or non-Muslim, entitled to their own use of languages throughout the empire. In fact, Albanians had their own schools. This is one of the oldest Albanian schools that survives. It's called Masonjatoria. And there were numerous such schools throughout Albania teaching the Albanian language. They did it in the Latin script, which of course was seen as very subversive, as opposed to doing it in the Ottoman script. But Albanian revolutionaries like Hasan Pristina wanted to increase the literacy of Albanians, and they saw this as the best opportunity to do so. Another thing that incensed the Albanians was taxes. Historically, Albanians were taxed differently from the Christian. Albanians were mostly Muslim, but mostly means about 55, 60%. The other roughly half of Albanians were Christian. But both Christians and Muslims, despite having different taxes, were taxed less before the CUP came to power. The CUP was a militaristic organization and wanted to promote the military capabilities of the Ottoman Empire, and so increased taxes uniformly. Additionally, many Muslims were reticent and angry that they were being taxed the same amount as the Christians, which was the policy of the CUP. So they revolted on the tax dispute issue. They had historically been entitled to better taxation rates, and this was a change in that. And the final thing is that all citizens of the Ottoman Empire, starting in 1909, were forced to join the Ottoman military, and the Albanians rejected this forcible conscription. They had, in previous years, volunteered in substantial numbers, and they didn't see why they needed to be compelled to join the military. They saw it as an insult and a violation of their historic relationship with the Ottoman Empire. And so in 1910 and again in 1912, you have Albanian revolts against the Ottoman Empire, the 1912 revolt being successful in securing an independent Albania. Between those Albanian revolts was the Italo-Turkish War. And so you can see year after year, the Ottoman Empire is embroiled in conflicts, and the Italo-Turkish War really showed a number of failures in the Ottoman military that the CUP would need to address. The first one you can see here, you have Mustafa Kemal, and we're going to see a lot of him. He is the future Ataturk, but that last name will not be assigned to him until the 1920s. Mustafa Kemal at this point was a commander in the Ottoman military, and accordingly, when the Italians invaded Libya, he was sent there in order to foment a Senussid resistance. The Senussi were a group of religious figures based in the eastern part of what is now Libya today, even though they controlled most of the region. And they had a very traditional Bedouin style of life. They were loyal to the Ottoman Empire as long as the Ottoman Empire didn't interfere too heavily in their politics, which was the case through most of the 19th century. But the real failure that the Ottoman Empire had is that its navy couldn't even compete with Italy's navy. Italy maintained power over the seas, and leaders like Mustafa Kemal were only able to get to Libya by going to Egypt as tourists and crossing the border illegally. So you can see how much of a deficit the Ottoman Empire was in terms of its naval capacity. That said, the Libyans made the Italians pay dearly for every ounce, for every inch that they acquired on Libyan territory. And this was really the first time that we see trench warfare. It actually precedes World War I. The Italo-Turkish War really sees the development of large-scale trenches with embattled positions because the defensive weapons are so much more effective than offensive weapons. We also see in this war the first use of aerial bombing. And this showed the Turks how badly they needed at least anti-aircraft weapons, if not their own air force. And you can see on the left-hand picture, Italian dirigibles, these are gigantic blimps, are bombing Turkish positions in Libya. The Italians ended up winning the war, and that gave them control of Libya and control of roads. But as I said, the Libyans continued to harass them until the 1930s, led by Omar al-Mukhtar. In 1912, due to the disastrous behavior during the Italo-Turkish War, there were what were called the Halaskar Zabitan, or the savior officers, who were members of the Liberal Union, and they overthrew the Committee of Union and Progress in 1912 in order to create a new power base. And they appointed another set of generals to serve as the Ottoman leaders. And so it looked like for the moment that the Committee of Union and Progress had been derailed. They fled to Thessaloniki, which was still under Ottoman control as Salonika, in order to regroup at the end of 1912. At this same time, we have the Balkan League forming. And the Balkan League puts together 4 nations: Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Greece. They all agree that they want to take over the Ottoman territory that remains in Europe, and they come to an agreement about how to divide it, at least somewhat. They agree on how they're going to advance and what they're going to do in order to secure their position. The Montenegrins, being so small, are not really considered an important ally for the war. The Bulgarians have the biggest army, and so they will be leading a march towards Constantinople. The Serbians will advance towards Macedonia, and the Greeks, with their large navy and supposedly ineffective army, would patrol the Mediterranean. Again, they had learned their example from the Italians. The lack of a Turkish naval ability meant that the Turks might not be able to send reinforcements if the Bulgarians successfully cut them off by land. And the Greek navy could operate in this sort of trajectory. And that's exactly what happens in 1912 when the Balkan states declared war with the Greeks. There's a comment here. Yes, the Ottoman Navy could not even compete with the Greek Navy in the Balkan Wars. That's exactly right. So we're going to focus first on the gains of the Bulgarians. The Bulgarians, as you can see here from this tactical map, concentrated their force in eastern Thrace and made a number of quick strikes on the city of Adrianople, modern Edirne, in Turkey. And you can see there, they're taking the fortress of Ayvaz Baba. There was also the battle at Kirkilise, and that battle went extremely well for the Bulgarians. They routed the Ottoman forces. It is still celebrated today in Bulgaria as one of their crowning military achievements. And the Ottoman forces were forced back closer and closer to Constantinople, their land access completely cut off. It's worth pointing out that the Bulgarians had within their ranks Armenian divisions. These were led by Andronik Ozanian and Grigory Njde. And these, of course, would become huge figures in the Caucasian Wars that we'll discuss soon in a few weeks. So the savior officers, in order to prevent a full-scale loss of Turkish territory, agreed to meet with the Bulgarian representatives at Çatalca and sign an armistice agreement. You can see that dashed line, and that dashed line represents the armistice that was signed between the parties. The Greeks, as I pointed out, were the naval power, and so they launched a number of boats throughout the Aegean Sea to cut off the possibility of Ottoman encirclement. Because remember, the Bulgarians had moved further east. They'd moved toward Constantinople. They'd cut off all land access. But if the Ottomans could land troops in Macedonia, which they controlled, then they could cut off the Bulgarians from the far side. Note that there are many more Ottoman soldiers than Bulgarian soldiers. They just happen to be in the wrong place and unable to effectively fight them. And here's where the Greeks really show their ability. You can see, for example, in the center, this is a Greek commemorative postcard of the sinking of the Fethi Bülent. Fethi Bülent was one of the larger Turkish ships, and the Greeks took it out of the Aegean before it was able to deliver its cargo of munitions and soldiers. The Greeks were also, however, competing with the Serbians over land because the Greeks and the Serbians and the Bulgarians all considered the area between their empires to be their land. And they all produced rival statistics, indicating that they felt that the Macedonian population, that is the population north of Greece and south of Serbia and Bulgaria, contained more Greeks than it did Serbs or Bulgarians. The Bulgarians showed figures that they contained more Bulgarians. The Serbs produced figures that said that they didn't care whether they were Bulgarians or Greeks or Serbs, that they would be Serbified or Serbicized. Very few of them actually cared to know what the opinions of the Macedonians themselves were. Many of them choosing to side with the larger countries that were of the same ethnicity, and other ones seeking a fully independent state, which was encapsulated in the struggle for Macedonia. As a result of the Balkan Wars, what ended up happening is that there was also a war declared on Albania. Greece wanted the southernmost regions of Albania. The Serbs wanted some of the eastern parts of Albania, and the Montenegrins wanted some of the northern parts of Albania. And so the Albanians were invaded by all of these different powers. You can see sort of a representation of this in the Albanian cartoon that you see there, where Shqiperia, which is the Albanian word for Albania, is heading off the Greeks, which are represented by that leopard, the Bulgarians, which are represented by the monkey, and the Montenegrins that are represented by the monkey, and the Serbians that are represented by the snake. And in fact, it would take an international coalition. The first time that I've heard of such an international coalition being formed here is here. And they arrived in Shkodër, Albania, after the Albanians had surrendered the city to the Montenegrins. You can actually see Esad Pasha Toptani surrendering Shkodër. Esad Pasha Toptani was actually one of the military officers, if you remember, who forced the resignation of Abdul Hamid II. But of course, now he was fighting for an independent Albanian state. There's a question of how fluid was the Macedonian identity. Could they all have been Hellenized, Bulgarianized, etc.? I think Bulgarianized is probably the easiest one. They all spoke a Slavic language that's very similar to Bulgarian. In fact, Bulgarian linguists argue that it is Bulgarian. They were part of the Bulgarian Exarchate, which was the Bulgarian church. So turning them into Bulgarians would not have been that hard. There were a large number of Greeks in Macedonia, especially towards the southern side of Macedonia. And if we go back, one of the things I forgot to mention is that the Greeks actually arrived at Thessaloniki literally a day before the Serbians did. And so the Turks surrendered Thessaloniki to the Greeks, and that's part of the reason why Thessaloniki is a Greek city today. So there was certainly some Hellenization that was possible. And we also know that the current Macedonian identity as it exists in North Macedonia today is in large part a development because of the Serbian control of the territory of North Macedonia throughout the 1920s to the 1980s. So there is a strong degree to which they can be pushed around on that spectrum. Nationality is not as concrete a thing as we like to pretend it is. So in 1913, because of the treaty of the armistice at Çatalca, the savior officers were deeply unpopular, and this gave the CUP the opportunity to come out of hiding and assassinate the leaders of the savior officer government and allow themselves to become a dictatorial leadership. Now, the emperor of the Ottoman Empire was maintained. That was Mehmed V at this point, but he's really a figurehead more than anything. And the real leaders behind the Ottoman Empire are a triumvirate of officials. You have Enver Ismail, who is there in the center. You have Mehmet Talat, who is the Minister of War. And you have Ahmed Jamal, who was the governor of Syria. And by Syria, I mean all of the Levant, right? So that's Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan were all territories that fell under his purview. But he was also the Minister of the Navy. And so he spent a lot of time in Constantinople as well. Following the CUP's come to power, Ismail Enver Pasha decided to reinforce his border with Bulgaria. And it could not have come at a better time for him, politically speaking. Bulgaria was angry after the First Balkan War that it had not been properly compensated with the territory in the Balkans that it had desired. And so Bulgaria launched a war, the Serbians and the Greeks were angry with the territory that the Bulgarians had taken in the Balkans and wanted to prevent Bulgarian power. At the same time, the Bulgarians were angry that they hadn't gotten all the territory that they had wanted. And so the Balkan League fell apart. The Serbs and Greeks actually invaded Bulgaria. And seeing this moment of weakness, Ismail Enver also launched his own invasion of Bulgaria. And the Romanians also went after Bulgaria, seeking to take the northernmost parts of Bulgaria for themselves. And you can see that invasion in the map on the lower right-hand side with a higher degree of concreteness. This resulted in Bulgaria losing territory in eastern Thrace that went back to the Ottoman Empire, including the city of Adrianople, which was a huge moral victory for the Ottoman Empire. Edirne, which is the Ottoman name for the city, was considered the second capital. If you remember all the way back to episode 17 and 18, Edirne was the first European capital of the Ottoman Empire, centuries before Constantinople, because Constantinople was in the hands of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. But Edirne was the European capital, and so retaking it was a reinstantiation and legitimation of the CUP triumvirate. And of course, finally, we cannot talk about the Balkan Wars without talking about the massacres, ethnic cleansings, and genocides that took place there. Significant numbers of Muslim population were expelled from the Balkans during the Balkan Wars. It's estimated that 1.5 million Muslim muhajir, or immigrants, were forced out of the Balkans and they represent a large number of different ethnicities. We have Bosniaks, we have Gorange, we have Torbeshi, we have Pomaks, we have Grecian Turks, we have Romanian Turks, and all of these populations were forced out. And Albanians, and these populations were forced out of the country and into the Ottoman Empire. We also have a number of Christian massacres. You can see, for example, these are Bulgarian or Macedonian, depending on how you view them, refugees, and they were fleeing from Aegean Macedonia, meaning the area that Greece controlled. The Greeks forcibly expelled them. And on the flip side, you had Greeks in the territory that Bulgaria now occupied, and those Greeks were expelled by Bulgaria. You had the Serbian cavalry entering Skopje, the capital of what is today North Macedonia. And when the Serbs entered North Macedonia, they killed any Macedonian that resisted the idea of a unique Macedonian identity that would be curated by Serbian ethnologists. Right? And when I say a unique Macedonian identity, I mean it in the sense of they were not Bulgarian, because there were many people in what is today North Macedonia who were considering themselves to be Bulgarians and were therefore supporting Bulgarian nationalists. So this gets to the nationalism of the Ottoman Empire under the CUP. The CUP's position was similar to those nations of the Balkans, in that there should be a state for the Turkish people. And this borrowed a lot from the Muslim state idea of Abdul Hamid II, that the Muslim identity, the Turkish identity, these were the identities of the Ottoman state. Those who felt differently, who could not be part of the union, would fall by the wayside. And so this is epitomized in this idea of Turanism, this idea that all the Turkic people should come into one state. You can sort of see that map in the lower right-hand side, where the Turks control the Balkans, because of course there were significant Turkish populations historically in the Balkans. It would include the Kurds, because according to their view, Kurds are also Turks. And it would include all the peoples of Central Asia who are actually Turkic in their ethnic origin, but it would also include, you can see Lake Baikal is there, because the Mongols are also considered Turkic in this sort of view. You ended up also having the forcible linguistic conversion of numerous parts of the empire that were not Turkish speaking. In particular, because most of the Balkans was now independent, that really fell upon the Arabs. And you had Arabs who were forced to learn Turkish, and they considered this to be a violation of their historic relationship with the Ottoman Empire. They had been loyal citizens of the empire. They had fought in its armies, and they had respected that in Constantinople they spoke Turkish, but within the various states of the Ottoman Empire, the further you were away from Constantinople, the more local power you maintained. And so the Arabs were quite angered that they didn't have the ability to maintain their own cultural perspective. There's a question of what is the argument that the Kurds are Turks? They are ethnically and linguistically separate. The argument that the Turks make, and this wouldn't be crystallized until the 1930s, because of this period, there wasn't so much idea that the Kurds were Turks. There was more flexibility on that. But the idea that there are Turks basically comes from the fact that the Turkish nationalists and Turanists who believed in Turkification, they said that those who spoke different languages, be they Circassians, be they Laws, be they Pomaks, be they Albanians, they all spoke these different languages as a result of the horrors of divided empire, and that these ethnicities that had arisen because of the languages were themselves divisive. And so what people needed to understand was that the languages that they were speaking was a historical accident. What they should be speaking is Turkish. And that's actually the basis of the Sun language theory. The Sun language theory, which you can see there, is the theory that all languages are actually derived from Turkish and are simply corruptions or bastardizations of Turkish. Of course, there's no linguistic evidence that actually suggests this to be true, but we have to remember that the early 20th century was a period full of pseudoscience masquerading as intelligent material. And accordingly, the language Kurdish was itself a bastardization of Turkish. And so the true Kurdish identity would be a Turkish identity. Obviously, most Kurds do not agree with this perspective. And today, most Turks don't agree with it either, but that was the ideology of the state at that period. So the Muhajirs, as I said, were coming out of the Balkans, and we've talked about how disruptive this was to the Ottoman Empire, how changing this was to the Ottoman Empire. And the Muhajirs were settled throughout the Ottoman Empire, in many cases, in places where Christians used to live, either because of deportation or because of aided expulsion. The last thing before we get to World War I was actually the issuing of the jihad, because when the Ottoman Empire entered World War I, we're going to discuss how that happened. The Shaykhul Islam, who is the highest Muslim official within the Ottoman Empire, because the Sultan Caliph didn't make Islamic jurisprudential rulings, the Shaykhul Islam did. The Shaykhul Islam issued the call to jihad on all Muslims throughout the world to fight the Entente powers. And one of the things that people often forget is that the empire with the largest number of Muslims was not the Ottoman Empire. It was the British Empire. The British Empire had more Muslims than the Ottoman Empire did because of its control of India. And so the goal of the Shaykhul Islam's declaration of jihad was to compel Indian Muslims to rise up against the British in the name of the Central Powers. It's actually quite shocking how weak the power of the Shaykhul Islam's invocation of jihad was. And in fact, we're going to see that Indian Muslims were a significant part of how the British were able to take down the Ottoman Empire, as well as Senegalese Muslims. Okay, so an hour in, we finally get to the topic of today's discussion. So this is World War I, right? And most people are familiar with the Western Front and the Eastern Front, but they might be less familiar with the campaigns around the Ottoman Empire. So let's zoom in on that a little bit. So actually, we'll take a second. If you look on this map, we have delineations between three different groups of countries. We have countries that are green. Those are the Allied powers. We have countries that are in orange. Those are the Central Powers. The Ottoman Empire is a Central Power. Russia and Britain and France are Allied powers. And of course, we have countries that are in red. Those are neutral countries. That's not to say that every country entered the war at the same time. In fact, we're going to talk about Greece and Bulgaria, which didn't enter the war until 1917 and 1916, respectively. And so we should be careful about how we understand this, but we should understand what that relationship was. um, and that Germany was the primary leader of the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary was significantly weaker than Germany was, as was the Ottoman Empire. Now, within Western Europe, there's pretty much one front, that Western Front. We'll talk a little bit about that. But within the Ottoman Empire, we have a multitude of fronts. The Ottomans were being attacked from 5 different points. And we're also going to talk a little bit about what happened in the Balkans. Those 5 different points are the Northwest, right? That's the invasion of Gallipoli. The Northeast, that's the Caucasus Campaign. The West, that's the Palestine Campaign. The East, that's the Mesopotamian Campaign. And the Arab Revolt in the South, in the Hijaz region. And at this time, the British were cultivating relationships with peoples of the Middle East and trying to understand them in sort of a half-hearted way, which led to the creation of what was called the Arab Bureau. In fact, you can see several of the members of the Arab Bureau in that picture. On the left-hand side is T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia. He was one of the leaders within the Arab Bureau. You can also see Hogarth, who was in the center, and he was really the commander of the Bureau, organizing the British relationship with the various Arab tribes that the Arab Bureau reached out to. In many cases, their understanding of the Middle East was extremely simplistic and failed to take into account the actual situation in the empire. And we'll talk about some of those failures throughout the presentation. So this is another sort of map where you can sort of see the expansion and movement of the people in the different parts of the Ottoman Empire. Those pink lines are the deportations of the Armenian genocide, which we covered in the previous 2 episodes. You can see the movement from the Central Powers into Serbia. Those are those red lines. You can see the Russian invasion and the furthest extent of that invasion, close to the city of Erzincan, in the yellow lines. You can also see the Turkish invasion of the Caucasus, which we'll talk about, and those are those red dashed lines. In fact, those red dashed lines are much higher in the south because those represent where the British made their final stand before the armistice at Mudros. All right. So we're going to get into the causes of the Great War. So there are traditionally 5 long-term causes that we talk about when we talk about the Great War. The first is the militarism, right? We have an increased amount of military spending and larger militaries in all of the countries of Europe, and that leads the situation, and that leads the possibility for competition. We also have that alliance system. We have numerous countries forming alliances with each other. France and Britain formed the Entente with the Russians. The Germans had alliances with the Ottoman Empire. They also had alliances, the Triple Alliance with Austria-Hungary and Italy. Italy, of course, reneges on the Triple Alliance and ends up fighting with the Entente powers. But by 1907, because of the creation of the Entente and the Triple Alliance, you had this very strong alliance network in Europe that would mean that any conflict would escalate into a large one. The next one is industrialism, which meant that you had a need for resources. This is what prompted the rise of colonialization. This prompted a massive rise in population, creation of modern goods, the mass production of military assets. All these play into each other that created an escalation here. And of course, imperialism, the political expansion and economic control that European countries wanted to manifest in Africa and Asia, and multinational states within Europe, states that had multiple ethnic groups inside of them. All these ethnic groups being led to, either through conversation or interaction, to believe in nationalism, that they should have control of their own regions because people should be ruled by their own ethnicity. And I just want to take a second to talk about that because it seems rather intuitive for many of us that a certain ethnic group should be in charge of its own destiny. But this is actually a really recent thought. It didn't occur before really the 19th century. Before then, right, kings and princes and other rulers were those that were either chosen by a divinity or had usurped power through the physical taking of power, military generals and the like. There was no idea of accountability for the ruler, simply because the ruler was divinely chosen. The gods would permit the ruler to rule and dethrone him when it was appropriate. And so you had these multinational empires throughout history without a single problem of nationalist insurrections. You had localized violence, certainly, if the ruler came from a foreign region. But there wasn't a coherent sense that the ruler should be from your own ethnicity. The idea of nationalism, though, tends to rip apart these empires according to historical, cultural, or other bases. And that leads to a lot of dissension within, for example, the Austrian Empire, which was riven with numerous nationalities, within the Russian Empire, within the Ottoman Empire. There's a comment that imperialism predates World War I, of course, and of course it does. And it also mentions how King Leopold of Belgium stripped the Congo of resources, with 5 to 10 million people being killed. Absolutely the case. Congo was one of the worst atrocities of the imperialist period, and that's really saying a lot. Okay, so when we think about the Ottoman Empire, we have to realize this is an empire that has been in conflict for a century, almost nonstop, right? We have the Napoleonic Wars, and concurrently we have the Serbian uprisings, and then we have the Ottoman-Saudi War, and then we have the Ottoman-Qajar War, and then we have the Greek War of Independence, and then we have the Russo-Turkish War of 1828, and then we have the Egyptian-Ottoman War, and then we have the Crimean War, and then we have the Russo-Turkish War of 1878, and then we have the Macedonian Struggle of 1893, and then we have all the Turkish revolts, right? We have the Hamidian massacres, we have the Italo-Turkish War, we have the First Balkan War, we have the Second Balkan War, and then finally we get to the First World War. So in contrast to Europe, where basically after Napoleon, there were some wars between countries on the European continent, but mainly their wars were far abroad and in remote regions of the world. The Ottoman Empire was constantly at war or facing incursions into its territory. And this meant that the Ottoman Empire was not as excited, let's say, to go to war as many of the European states were, right? You had this optimism. For example, in Britain, they were entering a war, the same with the Germans. This was a new conflict. How would it go? Of course, that optimism ended in about a month. But you had this sort of excitement about we're going to war. That was absolutely not the sensation within the Ottoman Empire. It was more of a, here we go again. And in fact, if you look at the declarations of war, there's only one declaration of war that the Ottoman Empire made, and that was the declaration of war against Greece in 1917. No, sorry, that was the declaration of war against, I'm trying to remember which one. But it's not, it's in the middle of the war. It's not even at the beginning of the war. I think, oh, sorry, it's against Romania in 1916. But it was the British, French, Russians, and Italians who declared war on the Ottoman Empire, not the other way around. And I want to give a sense also about, there's a question of what about the Greco-Turkish War of 1897? There were actually a dozen wars that I decided not to put on that list. And the Greco-Turkish War of 1897 was one of those. So I wanted to sort of do a triage of the biggest ones. So I also want to give a sense of how big the empires were. And so this is a map of the colonial empires as they existed in 1914 and the imperialist states. And you can see that the British Empire, the French Empire, these are massive international regions. Same with the German Empire and the Japanese Empire. And so you can really see how global this conflict would be, even if only even if only it was European states involved. I also want to sort of show the distinctions in population. So the countries in red are neutral states, the countries in orange are Entente powers, and the countries in yellow are Central powers. And you can see that the Ottoman Empire is less than half the size of Austria-Hungary and roughly a quarter the size of Germany in terms of population. The Ottoman Empire was small. And you can see also, if you compare Britain and France, they're both significantly larger than the Ottoman Empire in terms of population as well. That British number is probably buoyed significantly because of India. So if you take out India, the United Kingdom drops down to about 100 million. And then within the British Isles itself, it's about 40 million. But so the Ottoman Empire was expected to be a weak state, right? As we were talking about a little bit earlier, there's this idea of the sixth man of Europe, that the Ottoman Empire was just waiting to fall, that in 1878, the Russians had done quite a number on it. So had the Balkan Wars, the Italo-Turkish War. The Ottoman Empire was literally one strong wind away from collapsing. And that was something that the Ottoman Empire would strive to prove against. Another thing that I want to point out while I have the population map here is that Persia and Arabia have significantly less population than the Ottoman Empire. And for those people who are familiar with population numbers in the Middle East today, these numbers look rather surprising, I'm sure, to many of you. Germany today still has around roughly 80 million people, which is not much different than it did during 1914, because the German population would keep growing and then they keep losing it during the World Wars. But the population of the Middle East went through a massive explosion between the year 1940 and the year 1990. And it's still on a quite a high rise as well. But the population numbers that we're familiar with, like 80 million for Iran, are completely developments of the 20th century. Coming into the 20th century, Persia had 7 million people. At its historic height, previous to that, it would have been the Sasanian Empire. Was the last time that the Iranian population was so high, anything close to where it is today. There's a question of, is it true that statistically speaking, the British Empire acquired 25% of the world? I don't know if it's exactly 25%. It might be something a little bit less than that, but it's around a quarter. So it's either 20 to 25%, somewhere around there. It's certainly like that if we look at population. The entire world population at that time was 1.75 billion. And you can see the British have roughly 400 million under their leadership, which is about one quarter, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/5. Another thing that I wanted to sort of show are battle casualties. And we can see that the Ottoman Empire lost fewer people than many of the Entente powers. France, United Kingdom, Russia lost significantly more people. Now, of course, the reason why the Russians, French, and British lost so many people during the war was because of the trench warfare on the Western Front and on the Eastern Front. That's why the Germans suffered so colossally. And in fact, Ottoman losses were much more on the civilian side, for reasons that we're going to discuss in a little second. But you can see the casualty ratios. The Entente military suffered more than the Central Power military, but the civilians on the Central Power side suffered more than those on the Entente side. But we should be very clear how massive this war was. And in total, it's estimated that roughly 40 million people died as a result of the First World War, which makes it one of the biggest wars in history. So I want to compare France and the Ottoman Empire just to sort of drill down on this a little bit. If we see, for example, the Ottoman Empire lost a few fewer military deaths than France, but compared to its population, it made a much bigger sacrifice. But its civilian population suffered much more tremendously. Of course, half of that 4.2 million number is the Armenian, Assyrian, and Pontic Greeks who were eliminated in those genocides. But half of that number, around 2 million or so, 1.5 to 2 million, is Muslim civilians who were living within the Ottoman Empire. And these were civilians who were killed in, generally speaking, Russian or Armenian militant attacks, civilians who were killed as a result of occupations within the Ottoman Empire, and other serious issues, starvation, famines, things like that. And so you have a lot of pain and suffering on the Ottoman side, even if the numbers are not as, even if the numbers of military dead are nowhere near as high as the numbers of French military dead. So let's talk about how the war actually started, right? So you have this situation where, as we talked about, in 1908, Austria-Hungary annexes Bosnia, and it becomes part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian throne, visits Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, and he does so as part of sort of a get to know you, where he meets the local population. As a result, guards were rather thin on the ground. And the Black Hand that Apis, as I mentioned, organized, had 6 individuals tasked with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand while he was in Sarajevo. They believed that while he was there, he would be an easier target, which was true. He had fewer guards and he was closer to where Serbia was. Additionally, the people who were involved were local to the area and so could maneuver more effectively. That said, the assassination nearly failed. The first wannabe assassin he sort of clenched up in the moment, I think is the easiest way to say it. The third one tried to throw a bomb into the carriage, but it bounced off. And that bomb exploded, leading to a number of wounded going to the hospital. Archduke Franz Ferdinand wanted to go to the hospital despite the recommendations of all the local officials saying that he should leave and avoid further possible harm. But his driver actually got lost and pulled into a dead end where Gavrilo Princip, who was the 6th member and was just relaxing in a cafe, saw the Archduke out of his window, cornered in the dead end. Gavrilo Princip took out his pistol and he shot both Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, and the 2 of them died of their injuries. Now, Gavrilo Princip was arrested and put on trial. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The reason his sentence was so short was that he was a minor at the time. But in 1918, he contracted a number of diseases due to his harsh treatment in Austrian jails, and he died slightly before the war ended. Princip has been a source of contention within Serbia. There are those who support him, and in fact, both Vučić and his successor, the presidents of Serbia, have wanted to erect a memorial to Princip and his sacrifice on behalf of Serbian independence. But among most of the world population, he is still vilified for having been the spark that caused the First World War. That said, what happened afterwards was that the Austrians pressured the Serbian government with a number of really difficult requirements in order to prevent outright war as a response to this loss in prestige. And ironically, the Serbians were willing to comply with the vast majority of those requirements. But the problem is that the Austrians could not accept yes for an answer. And so they declared war on Serbia within the month. One thing I want to talk about actually before we get involved, and this is something that I find interesting, is the creation of national identity. So you have this Muslim population in Bosnia, and up to this point, they don't have a coherent sense of identity other than that they are Slavic speaking and they are Muslim. And accordingly, we have sort of a split in the community. The majority embrace what is called the Bosniak identity. This is an identity that would be named in the 90s, but was really sort of contextualized in this period. And probably the most famous speaker on this part was Mehmed Beg Kapetanović Ljubashak. You can see him there. He was mayor of Sarajevo between 1893 and 1899. He advocated strong support of the Austro-Hungarian government. which makes sense considering they empowered him. But he wrote extensively on the idea that there were Serbs who were Orthodox, there were Croats who were Catholic, and those national identities affixed themselves to the religious identity. And it should still be the case that the Muslim identity should affix itself in the same way to the Slavs who inherited it. What name those people should have, he went with Bosniak, which is the Bosniak term for Bosniak. But that was one among many names that were in contention at that point. You also had the organization within the Austro-Hungarian Empire was that there were actually three distinct rulership categories. There were the territories that were directly under the control of the Austrian crown. There were those territories under the control of the Hungarian crown. And then Bosnia, because it was annexed later, was under its own sort of organization. And so Bosnia-Herzegovina had its own regiments that were part of the larger Austro-Hungarian military, but weren't under the direct control of Austro-Hungarian leadership. Austrian or Hungarian leadership within the military, because as I said, it was segregated among the three. And so you can see Bosniak military regiments because there are imams there. This is the only this is the only significantly Muslim group. Depending on the year of enlistment, between 31 and 50% of the members of the Bosnian military forces are Muslims, right? The other come from the Serbian Orthodox and the Croat Catholic that are resident in Bosnia, right? Bosnia is a multi-confessional region. But you can see that they were integrated with the general Austrian forces that were fighting on the Italian front and fighting in the Eastern Front. There's a question, was Emperor Charles I the successor of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary? Yes, that is who he was. But it was not the case that all Muslims within Bosnia-Herzegovina saw themselves as a separate identity from the Serbs. In fact, many of them considered that they had Serb ancestry, they converted to Islam, but didn't lose their Serbian identity. And so there became this term called Serb Muslims, meaning that they were Serbs, they just happened to be of Muslim religious faith. And in fact, Mohammed Mehmed Bashic, who you can see in the top, was one of those 6 assassins who wanted to kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So he was fighting for the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist group, as a Muslim, as a non-Orthodox Serb. And to the extent that he proved his loyalty, he was brought into further and further confidences of the Black Hand organization. Another similar individual is Mustafa Golubic, who you can see in the lower left-hand side, who fought for the Serbian army and performed many clandestine missions during World War I on behalf of the Serbians. His loyalty was never questioned by the Serbian side, despite the fact that he was an avowed Muslim. And you also have societies in Sarajevo that identified as Serb Muslims. You can see, for example, this is a society of musicians, and they all identified as Serb Muslims. Despite living in Sarajevo, where most of the Muslims identified as Bosniaks or Muslims, without that Serb affixed to it. Over time, Serb Muslim has sort of disappeared as an identification, especially with the Bosnian War of 1995, 1992 to 1995, where it really crystallized the Bosniak identity as being the Muslim identity in Bosnia and in Serbia. For Slavic Muslims. But during this time, it wasn't entirely clear that that was what was going to end up happening. So we have this sort of march to war, right? So we have the assassination on June 28th. A month later, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. On 2 days later, the Russians begin mobilizing because the Russians had an alliance to protect the Serbians. On August the 1st, in order to protect their ally, Austria-Hungary, knowing that Russia was going to declare war on them, the Germans declared war on the Russians, and the Germans declared war on the Russian ally of France. Great Britain, 1 day later, declares war on Germany, And on August 6th, Russia and Austria-Hungary are now at war. By August 12th, Great Britain has now declared war on Austria-Hungary. But notice that in all of this discussion, we don't see the Ottoman Empire at all. Because at this point, the Ottoman Empire is a neutral party and is actually courting both sides. For those of you who've seen my earlier lectures, you probably remember Ahmed Reza. Ahmed Reza was one of the founders of the CUP and one of the few CUP senators in the Ottoman Senate who spoke up against the Armenian genocide while it was happening. Ahmed Reza was reaching out to the British during the fall of 1914, trying to create a relationship between the Ottomans and the British. Remember, the Ottomans and the British had fought together in the Crimean War, so the possibility of a Ottoman-British alliance was not so far gone. But increasingly, it was made clear to Ottoman representatives that the British considered appeasing the Russians more important than appeasing the Ottomans. And since the Russians were the historical enemy of the Ottomans, it was a relationship that they really couldn't hold. I also want to talk a little bit about the weapons of World War I, because World War I was quite revolutionary in terms of the way it was fought. But in particular, it's strange because of how defensive a lot of the weapons are, right? Machine guns are great as defensive weapons, not great as offensive weapons. Gas canisters can eliminate defensive positions, but don't actually gain you any ground. Shelling, howitzers, all these things, they're primarily defensive in function. And so World War I ends up being a situation, especially on the Western Front, where very little territory is won because the confrontation is primarily defensive. There's a question, is the US part of the Allies? The US is an Entente power, but the US doesn't join until 1917. So Germany decides to try and knock out France in the beginning of the war and engages in what's called the Schlieffen Plan. So they invade neutral Belgium to circumvent French defenses along the Franco-German border. And after some advances that get them very close to Paris, the French win a victory at the First Battle of the Marne, and that pushes the German back to the defensive line identified here in December 1914 on the Aisne River. Now, that basically stays the line between the French and the Germans for the next 4 years. And it becomes a meat grinder, for want of a better term. And a lot of World War I's focus is on that. So I'm going to walk away now. The only thing I'm going to say is that the method of trench warfare meant that very small amounts of territory would be gained in any advance. Typically, what would happen is you had these support trenches, and then there would be a frontline trench, and then you would have what was called a forward listening post or a SAP. And these SAPs would be extended as far as they could. And if they could extend the SAP far enough, then they would build a new trench there, and they would try to advance the line. That meant that if you were lucky, you were making a few yards in the course of a week. Very slow going, very little land exchanging between the two sides. And of course, because these trenches were below the water table, remember that they're being dug mostly in northern France and Belgium, which are at or below sea level, very close to sea level. If you dig those 6 feet deep to build a trench, you're at the water table. So you have mud, and the ground is very unstable. You have numerous diseases that manage to grow up there. And so more people die as a result of the diseases than from the actual violence itself. Now, within the Ottoman Empire, as I pointed out, they had a fundamental issue with the British. And that fundamental issue with the British was exemplified by Louis de Pont-Mallet, who was the British envoy to the Ottoman Empire. apparently the only picture of him that survives is this one of when he was part of a Shakespearean acting company. So that explains his lack of diplomatic attire. But he pledged to help the Ottoman Empire install British control over their economic resources, which really shows that he was not attentive to what the Ottoman Empire was looking for at the time that World War I was beginning. The Ottoman Empire was looking for more independence than there had previously been. There's a question, were the British involved in the Blitzkrieg? I believe the British invented this. That is false. Blitzkrieg was invented by the Germans, and it was involved in World War I. Sorry, World War II. But anyway, so Louis Dupont-Mallet basically alienated the Ottomans, and one further action by the British really ended the possibility of British-Ottoman collusion. The Ottomans had paid for 2 British dreadnoughts that would be built and then sent to the Ottoman Empire. Seeing the war coming, Winston Churchill, in his position as First Lord of the Admiralty, confiscated those dreadnoughts for the United Kingdom. They were rechristened. In fact, ironically, one of them, the HMS Agamemnon, became the boat upon which the Ottomans would sign the armistice at Mudros, which was effectively their surrender in World War I. But because of this deprivation, the Ottomans were fiercely antagonistic towards the British. Another thing which solidified their antipathy towards the Entente was that the Russians were enforcing the Armenian Reform Package of 1914. So under Article 61 of the Berlin Congress of Berlin, the Armenians were to have new international protections. And so there was a reform package signed in 1914 between the Ottoman Empire and the Russians concerning the development of an international observatory group who would look over the Armenian situation. The Ottomans were fiercely angry towards this and sought a way to nullify it. In fact, when World War I finally did occur, they did nullify it, and that was part of what led to the Armenian genocide, the lack of international protection or supervision. But Britain, as an Entente power, was supportive of Russia enforcing this, which meant that that relationship was no longer going to last. But knowing now that those 2 dreadnoughts had been canceled, the Germans saw an opportunity to create a new, stronger Ottoman-German relationship, that even more so than before. And so the Germans decided to send 2 of their own ships, one a large-scale dreadnought called the Goeben, rechristened as the Yavuz Selim Sultan, and the Breslau, rechristened as the Midili, to the Ottoman Empire. For those of you who are curious, SMS is Seine Majestät Schiff, which is the German for His Majesty's ship. Now, Ismail Enver was very excited to negotiate these purchases with the Germans, and in fact, he facilitated their entry into the Dardanelles. Now, as we're going to see when we talk about the Battle of Gallipoli, the Dardanelles is a very narrow, straight passage that leads to the Sea of Marmara and indirectly to Istanbul and the Black Sea, meaning that it's an important strait to get to if you want to go to Constantinople and to the Ottoman center. The Ottomans had mined the Dardanelles, but they knew how to let the Germans through. And in fact, the Germans still continued to commandeer the ships. The Ottoman Navy was in its infancy. And so it actually made more sense to leave the German commander on board, just switch the uniforms. So Wilhelm Souchon, who despite having a French name, his ancestry was Huguenot. Despite having a French last name, he was born and bred in Germany, and he remained the commanding admiral for the Yavuz while it was in Ottoman hands. Souchon had the feeling that the Ottoman Empire should be forced to fight on the German side because the alliance that the Ottoman Empire had with Germany was open to multiple interpretations. The Ottoman interpretation was that if Germany were attacked, then the Ottoman Empire should respond, But remember, Germany was the one that declared war on France, and Germany was the one that declared war on Russia. So the Ottomans said that the Germans could not call up this alliance. Souchon disagreed. They felt that the alliance should be honored and the Ottoman Empire should be dragged into the war. And so in late October of 1914, he led the Yavuz and several other Ottoman ships to attack major ports that Russia had along the Black Sea. In particular, they attacked Sevastopol and Novorossiysk. You can see Novorossiysk harbor on flames. That was ignited by the Midili. And the Yavuz went after Sevastopol and Odessa. These fights led to the Russians declaring war on the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Empire being dragged into the war. As soon as the Russians declared war on the Ottoman Empire, the British and French followed suit, as well as the Italians. And so we're going to move through several different campaigns in the war. The first that we're going to talk about is the Balkan War, which of course, ironically, is one of the least studied of the parts of World War I, despite the fact that the original war was Austria-Hungary versus Serbia. And so what ends up happening is that the Austro-Hungarians try repeatedly to breach the Serbian border, but they can't. Through all of 1914 and through much of 1915, the Serbians managed to repel the Austro-Hungarian force, despite it being significantly larger than anything the Serbians could bring to bear. It wasn't until October of 1915 that the Bulgarians made a choice to join the war. Now, remember, the war started in July of 1914. So this is over a year after the war has started that the Bulgarians joined the war. And in Bulgaria, this was a very tense situation. There were people who believed that Bulgaria should join on the Allied side, especially since their historic enemy, the Ottomans, was a central power. And there were those who felt that Bulgaria should get back at Serbia for the territory that it had taken in Macedonia. And ultimately, Germany was able to provide assurances that the Bulgarians could retake that territory from Serbia, and if Greece entered the war from Greece. And this resulted in the Bulgarians and Austrians coordinating an attack, where the Bulgarians attacked from the eastern side and the Austrians from the northwestern side, the two of them partitioning Serbia in the fall of 1915. You can see a picture of that partition with the green part under Bulgarian occupation and the gray part under Austrian occupation. During the Serbian military fled, and you can see sort of the arrows toward the Albanian coast. They fled out to Albania and then came into Thessaloniki in 1916. In order to pursue them, the Bulgarians and Austrians pursued them into northern Greece in 1916, especially after Greece declared itself to be an allied power. And we're going to get in, and the reason it took Greece so long is that Greece was divided. Greece in the northern part was controlled by Venizelos as a result of the Goudi coup. But the king of Greece, Constantine I, was actually a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm. And so his sympathies were for the Germans, which kept Greece in a state of neutrality. However, in 1916, there was a coup within Greece, and Venizelos removed Constantine I and effectively became prime minister of Greece. There was a new king, but Venizelos really had all of the power. And accordingly, he brought in the Serbian military that had fled to northern Greece with British and French reinforcements, and prepared an operation to attack back into Serbia. Ultimately, Serbia would be liberated by this Operation Struma. sorry, by what followed in the Vardar offensive. But it took a long time, and Serbia suffered mightily under the joint occupation. Bulgarians and Austrians both committed numerous massacres of civilians. And in fact, Serbia lost 1/3 of its population, not 1/3 of its military, 1/3 of its population as a result of World War I. There's a comment that Britain's George V was also a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm. The First World War was a cousin's war. That's absolutely correct. It seems that the family ties carried a little bit more weight with the Greek, with Constantine I than it did with George V. Now into the Caucasus. So a few things that we should point out before we really discuss the Caucasus campaign. The first one is that the entire eastern part of Anatolia, which you can see in that large blue circle, had no railroads. The Ottoman Empire was woefully deficient in the amount of railroad track that had been laid in the empire. And you can compare this to Britain, France, Russia. These countries had extensive railroad networks and had built them very close to the border, to their borders, in order to facilitate the transport of troops to the war front. Because of this, the Ottoman Empire will have an immensely difficult time sustaining their troops along the border with the Russians. In fact, you can see that small little blue circle is the furthest east in Anatolia that the railroad goes. That's the city of Ankara today, the modern capital of Turkey. Now, I want to point out a few places on the map on the left-hand side. The map on the left-hand side represents the furthest expanse of Russian control in September of 1917. Those yellow areas were areas that were part of the Ottoman Empire in 1914 that were now under Russian control. In the orange territory, you can see in the blue circle, that's Sarıkamış. And we're going to talk about Sarıkamış in a bit. We're going to talk about Van, which is in the southeast, close to the lake. We're going to talk about Köprüköy, which is in that sort of upwise oval. And we're going to talk about Erzurum. So these are important places that we're going to see. The Russian forces are going to be led by primarily one military commander, that's Nikolai Yudenich. There are going to be a number of other Russian commanders, but he's really the one who leads this front. And we're going to see not only Russian troops, but Armenian volunteers. And we have Armenian volunteers in the hundreds of thousands. Some of these Armenian volunteers are Russian citizens, in the sense of they are from the Russian Empire, and they form auxiliary units based in the Russian Empire. And others of these are parts of the Dashmatsutun and the Hunchaks, who are already operating in Eastern Anatolia, and now with Russian authority, they are operating more as an auxiliary force to the Russian military because of the Armenian genocide, really facilitating the need for the Armenians to form an effective resistance to the Ottomans. So, as we discussed in several previous lectures, the eastern part of Anatolia had numerous Kurdish chieftains who had historically been dominants in the region, and so a lot of Ottoman control of the region was dependent on these Kurdish tribal chieftains supporting them. Now, in this war, they lost a lot of those Kurds, not because they died, although many Kurds did die in the First World War, but because those Kurds were involved in the Armenian genocide. They were involved in the massive deportations of the Armenians and in hunting down those groups that were leaving. And so it required the Ottoman militaries to stabilize the front. So then we get to the Battle of Sarıkamış. At first, we have a Russian offensive that starts to move across Ottoman territory. And so Ismail Enver takes a page out of the German playbook and decides that he is going to do something similar to the Battle of Tannenberg, which on the Eastern Front removed entire Russian armies from the map. And he's going to do this at Sarıkamış, which we pointed out was on the Russian side of the border. Sarıkamış was in historic Ottoman Empire, historic Ottoman imperial territory. It was part of the Ottoman Empire before the 1878 Russo-Turkish War, but had been under Russian control since that point. Now, the Russians were well embedded in Sarıkamış, and it was an area in the mountains, very cold, and you can see the Russian soldiers were wearing an incredible amount of protection to keep them safe from the cold. The forces led by Ismail Enver were fewer in number, unable to handle the cold because they didn't bring as many coats. They were trying to travel quickly, and they were lower on provisions. As a result, Sarıkamış was a complete rout for the Ottomans and presaged the further Russian advance into the Caucasus region. That Russian advance was complemented by the Armenian defense at Van. As we mentioned when we talked about the Armenian genocide, the Armenians of Van were approached by Cevdet Pasha, who was the governor general of the region, asking for conscripts. The Ottoman army had Armenian soldiers in it. It had Christians in it since 1909. And Van refused to hand over conscripts, arguing that in previous towns where conscripts were handed over, then massacres of those towns had occurred. Accordingly, Cevdet Bey was pushed out of the city of Van, and the Dashnaks took control of the city, led by Ara Manukian. They proceeded to expel or exterminate those Turks who were living in the city, and then proceeded to produce their own weapons to protect the Armenian population of Van. They managed to hold out for several months before Yudenich was able to send in Russian forces to liberate the city, at least from the Armenian perspective, to liberate the city and bring it under Russian control. In fact, Van would remain under Russian control throughout the Russian continuing advance through Anatolia. Yudenich himself was able to mastermind a new offensive in 1916 in the middle of winter. This was one advantage that the Russians had over the Ottomans, was that they were able to move more effectively in winter than the Ottomans were, and central Anatolia can get quite cold. We're talking about temperatures in the negative 20s Celsius, in the negative 10s Fahrenheit, and so these temperatures can be prohibitive for Turks who are not used to those low temperatures. But the Russians can handle that. And so in January of 1916, Ismail Pasha had wagered that the Russians would not make an offensive and therefore tried to bolster his other fronts. That was a costly mistake. And Nikolai Yudenich brought a new strike force down on the city of Köprüköy. And he decided to do a new attack method, which is that he attacked one part on the northern flank, one part on the southern flank to divert the Ottoman forces. And with the central column, he used his main force to demolish the Ottoman defenders and take the city. He then moved to Erzurum, which had one of the most extensive fortifications within the entirety of the Ottoman Empire. Very similar to a mini Maginot Line, for those of you who are familiar with that. You had a number of fortresses connected by a number of tunnels and over ramparts. The thing is, though, that with all those forces allocated to the other fronts, Erzurum couldn't actually be maintained by the soldiers who were defending it. And after about a month of siege, Yudenich was able to take the fortress at Erzurum. And you can see this Russian commemorative stamp talking about the Erzurum campaign, the Erzurum operation, Erzurum Operatia, in March of 1916. And you can see this is actually a stylized picture of Russians posing next to a Turkish gun after having taken the position at Erzurum. Russians advanced further west of Erzurum towards the city of Erzincan. And along the way, there's a question about my spelling. I use the che mark for any time I have the sound ch. So it's not an indication of his origin. He is Russian. So as the Russians are approaching the city of Erzincan, they arrive in small Armenian villages that existed between Erzurum and Erzincan, one of these being Sheikhalan. And in Sheikhalan, you can see this is one of the pictures that the Russians presented as evidence of the Armenian genocide. You can see the Armenian skulls littered across the ground. And in many cases, the discoveries of these massacres lead to both Russians and Armenians killing Turkish civilians in anger over what had happened. One particularly vile massacre from the Russian side was led by Vladimir Viliakhov. Now, for those of you who have followed the series, you may remember that in episode 41 or 42, we talked about the creation of the Persian Cossacks and their instantiation of the Qajar dynasty. Those Persian Cossacks were led by Vladimir Viliakhov. In 1909, he left Persia and came back to Iran and was, left Persia and came back to Russia and was given a position in Georgia, close to the city of Batumi. Now, Vladimir Viliakhov ordered a massacre of all Muslims surrounding his area in the Chorlu River, which is close to the Turkish-Georgian border today. And the massacre close to the Chorlu River ended up killing estimated between 100,000 and 125,000 Muslim civilians in the region. The Russians didn't restrict their campaign to the Ottoman Empire. At this time, Persia was a neutral country on paper, but there was a lot of fighting taking place in that territory. And that fighting was between multiple parties. Jevdet Bey, right, that same governor who was expelled from Van, launched a cross-border invasion into Iran to take the region of Urmia and support Kurdish revolts that were taking place there. Those Kurdish revolts being inspired by the declaration of jihad that we talked about earlier. Now, accordingly, the Russians wanted to stamp this out and secure their control over northern Iran. Northern Iran had been a Russian sphere of influence since the Anglo-Russian Pact of 1907. So in order to enforce their position, the Russians sent their own military, and they met up with the Assyrians. The Assyrians are another Christian minority, also persecuted during the CUP genocides. And the Assyrian militants were led by Aga Petros, who you can see in the center, and by their patriarch, Mar Shimun the 19th, Benjamin. And Mar Shimun was more of the diplomatic face of the Assyrian community. Aga Petros, or Petros Elia Abbas, was the militant face. And together, the Russians and the Assyrians fought against the Kurds and their Turkish supporters. Violence in the region would continue, in fact, until 1921, when Reza Shah Pahlavi was able to bring that entire area under the control of the imperial state of Iran, or the Pahlavi dynasty. Now, the Russians, after the Erzurum campaign, were able to contain their positions, but were not really able to advance much further. There's a question, what caused the famine in Persia? A number of things caused the famine in Persia. The weather was bad. There were fewer people to work on the field because of all the massacres. There was a lot of instability throughout the country. And a lot of food was allocated towards the front because there were Persian soldiers who tried to keep everybody out. So there's a lot of different issues. All right, but in 1917, the Russian front couldn't advance. And of course, those who are familiar with Russia know that in February of 1917, there was the first of many Russian revolutions. But the February 1917 revolution put in power a caretaker government led by Kerensky, and that government continued the war. In October of 1917, there was another revolution which put the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks into power. And the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, who would then eventually fight among each other, made their first order of business ending the war with the Ottoman Empire. That said, they issued a statement called the Decree on Turkish Armenia, where they argued that Stepan Shahumyan, a communist official of Armenian ancestry, should be able to administer the territories of Turkish Armenia and allow them to have a plebiscite to choose their own form of government, assuming, of course, that they would vote for a communist style of government as part of the larger communist revolution. Stepan Shahumyan also had to coordinate with generals on the ground. Probably the most famous of these generals and most prevalent was Tovmas Nazarbakian, called Nazarbekov in Russian. And he had been fighting as one of those Armenian auxiliaries, right? Remember, those Armenian soldiers were not part of the Russian army. They were fighting alongside the Russian army. And he was one of the leading generals of those auxiliaries. And so he became in charge of fighting the Ottoman Empire, as the Ottoman Empire then turned around and tried to reconquer the territory that the Russians had taken. The Armenian auxiliaries and Shahumyan's representatives were significantly weaker than the Ottoman Empire. And so the Ottoman Empire began to advance towards the east. In fact, the Ottoman advance would even get as far as Baku, ignoring both the Georgian Republic and the First Armenian Republic. We're going to talk more about this Caucasian War in a separate meeting, so I'm not going to go into the details here, but suffice it to say that the Ottoman Empire was able to push the Russians out of their areas of control, and in fact extend its control to areas that it had not held since the 16th century. Now, in order to get itself out of the war, the Russians signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and those who are familiar may know that that gave the Germans and Austrians significant amounts of territory within Europe. You can see all of the territory on the western side of that dark red line, belonging to Russia, being ceded to the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. But you can also notice that Russian territories within the Middle East were also ceded. All of the former Turkish territory was vacated. The areas of occupation in northern Persia were also vacated, and significant parts of Transcaucasia, including most of today's Azerbaijan, almost all of today's Armenia, and half of today's Georgia, were given to the Central Powers. I have a comment that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is one of the worst treaties in history, because they were waiting for the global Marxist revolution. Yeah, I agree. And I think actually if the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had really ended World War I, World War II would have come even faster because of how damaging the treaty was in terms of its demands on Russia. There's a question of what is the Mount Republic? The Mount Republic was it's the Mountain Republic. The territory is what's today called Dagestan, and it was a number of independent Muslim populations within what was controlled by Russia in the Caucasus, that had been very resistant to the Russians throughout the 19th century. In fact, these are sort of the descendants of Imam Shamil, for those who are familiar with that. And during this period, as Russian power retreated very close to St. Petersburg and Moscow with the Russian revolutions and the Russian Civil War, these minorities began to declare more independence and, to a certain extent, an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. In fact, soldiers from the Caucasus joined Kurds and other irregulars from the Ottoman Empire to form what was called the Army of Islam. That was one of the predominant Ottoman imperial conquering forces in the Caucasus. All right, the next thing that we're going to talk about is the raid across the Suez, and this happened in early 1915. So you can see on the map on the lower right-hand side the original border between Egypt, which was a British protectorate, and the Ottoman Empire is that green line. The Ottomans advance west across the desert towards the Suez Canal, which is blue. They are beaten back close to the canal, and they retreat to the city of El Arish, and the city of Al Nakhl, which is not on this map, but following that sort of jagged line, which became their holding point through much of 1915. At this point, the Suez is being held by what was called the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, which was made of really two general components. You have forces that are coming from England, and you're also having forces that are coming from India. So you can even see in the picture, if you look closely, on the left-hand side, you have British troopers, the Hertfordshire Yeomanry. And if you look in the back, you can see the camels. Those are the Bikaner Camel Corps coming from the Indian region of Bikaner. The British used Indians to a significant degree in their Middle Eastern theater. And as I mentioned before, many of these Indians were Muslims. So they were fighting against the most powerful Muslim state with the Muslim Sheikh al-Islam and the Caliph on behalf of the British Empire. You can also see the Ottoman forces, which are both modern and involving a number of Arab irregulars. Contrary to what the Arab Bureau believed, a significant number of Arabs both enlisted within the Ottoman army and enlisted in irregular forces that were requested by the Ottoman army to attack the British, who they saw as the greater imperialists. This also sees the sort of ambitions of Ahmed Jamal. Remember, Ahmed Jamal is the governor of Syria, which includes what is today Israel, and so this is his border with British Egypt, and he is seeking to expand that. He knows that if he takes the Suez, he'll be able to cut off India from the rest of the British Empire, and this will make the British substantially weaker, which is why the British pour a lot into defending this position. And we're getting close to the witching hour, so I'd rather leave Gallipoli and what comes after for next week. So, questions, comments, concerns? There's a question of what are some good books on this subject? Some good books on this subject. There are a lot of books published about the role of the British in the Middle Eastern theater. I think Kingmaker is a really good one. There's in terms of the Ottoman side, sources are a lot harder. I don't know if somebody could put in the chat Russian and Ottoman sources, then that would be really helpful. There's a question of, will the next segment have more focus on the United States? The answer is no. The United States is largely irrelevant in the Middle East during World War I, and so we're really not going to talk about the United States because they don't show up. There's a question, how do the Ottomans do so much better than the Europeans expected as the sick man of Europe? The Ottoman forces were incredibly modernized, and as we're going to see in Gallipoli, they made a number of their tactical leaders were making very key decisions. In fact, a lot of the times, things like, for example, the Russians couldn't expand as far as they wanted in Anatolia because their supply lines wouldn't keep up. The Russians didn't have a way of getting supplies effectively into Erzincan and Erzurum or Trabzon. Right? Even Trabzon was on the coast, and they didn't have an effective navy that could continually shuttle those goods and resupply their troops so that they could expand their front line. So the Ottomans managed to do well in Gallipoli because of Mustafa Kemal's command. They managed to do well in Kut al-Amara because of Hilal Bey's intuitive ability. They did well in the Palestine campaign because of how difficult the Sinai was to cross. It was just the natural barrier. They did well in the Caucasus to the degree that they did it only as badly as they did in the Caucasus because of the difficulty of Russian supply lines. There's a question of, will you send an invite for the next talk? It's already up on Meetup. It's listed as the Turkish War of Independence now. I'm obviously going to change the title. So that way it can reflect the fact that it's going to be the second half of World War I. But that link should already be on Meetup for next week. If you're connected through Robert. Robert will be responsible for handling that link.
Hey, Rich, can I just offer some future programs or you want to talk about uh, since we have people on, 50 people on still?
Sure, go ahead.
So this Saturday, we have at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, we have something that's called Akkadian language. That language has been dead for 2,600 years ago. It used to be lingua franca of those days, which is actually a first lingua franca Semitic language, followed by, preceded it was Sumerian, which was not a Semitic language, and we will discuss all that on 12 p.m. And it would be actually a presenter would be John Maloney, who would be has a PhD in that languages like Sumerian and Akkadian. And if you wanted to check out one of his presentations, it's on the YouTube channel called Fitness History Investing, and he did a presentation on Gilgamesh, where he talks about in nauseam about the Akkadian and Sumerian language. Then we have philosophy, which is we're doing philosophy from India. It was a Jason's group that does it. We're going to talk about concept of non-dualism. If anybody wants to join, we'll have a lot of good discussions. Be at 7 p.m. on Saturday. On Sunday, please join us. So Dr. Sabeel, I think it's at 2 o'clock. We'll be presenting social issues in Islam. That's this week. On Monday, we're going to talk about Socrates and philosophy of Roman Greek philosophy. And on Thursday, as Richard had mentioned, we're going to continue on the Middle Eastern subjects. And if you can join us. And just one more mention, we have many, obviously, programs, but on 8/7, we have something that's called Powerful Woman series. And Jane is going to talk about Mary, the Queen of Scots. So anybody's interested, drop by to watch it. But as you can see, every Thursday, please walk it on your schedule for Richard. And also he does European Union series on Sundays. When is the next one, Richard? You do?
Sorry?
European Union. When is the next European
Next
Union?
European Union will be on August 21st. Yeah. There's a question of can you there's sort of a question about if there's a calendar. The easiest way to look at it is just to look at the events either in the History Mostly Ancient group or the events in the New York Social group, and both of those will have all the events, and you can sort of see that as a calendar. There's a question here that I'm sort of struggling to understand a little bit, and the question is, what was the point of all this internecine fighting? Was it to break up the Ottoman Empire and establish the Brits to be in control of the area and establish the British Empire? I'm not quite sure what internecine fighting means in this context. If you're asking why are the Ottomans fighting on many fronts, the British are doing that explicitly to rip the empire apart. If the Ottomans have to focus at one point, they can't focus at another point. And so the goal is to weaken the Ottoman Empire. Additionally, as we're going to see, there are Russian war aims that focus on controlling parts of the Ottoman Empire. And the British wanted to secure that the Germans could not threaten India. The British also have a war aim concerning petroleum and the acquisition of more petroleum. So you have a lot of these different things going on at the same time.
This is my first time. Is this audio or is this presentation available? Such a tremendous amount of information. It will be great to watch it again on a tape. How do you do that?
Yeah, so we, as we mentioned, all of these are recorded and they are uploaded to our YouTube channel. Zach, if you could put in the comment section a link to our YouTube channel. As I said, this is the 45th in the series. There are 44 episodes that precede this. All of those are recorded as well. So you can watch basically from the time of Muhammad until this. I sort of track the Middle Eastern Muslim states and talk about what the politics, religion, history during that period was. So, and obviously you can go through it and take a little bit more time, go through things a little bit more slowly, see the different connections between the different time periods. And the reason I did it this way is that way there's so much that builds up to these moments in the 20th century that it's much easier if you have that longevity of view.
Super. Thank you. Appreciate that presentation.
Richard, I put the link to our channel on.
Yeah, I just saw that. So Andrew, if you go to the chat and you see the link, you can copy that. Like just copy it into your internet browser or something. So that way you have it. Anybody else who wants to look at our channel and do that. And there are links to, you know, GoFundMe and everything else on Meetup that you can do. We appreciate any contributions and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Richard. Incredible presentation. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.